Hello, everybody. So this video is part two in a short series getting ready for in the fall semester. I'm teaching software development with Java, and for the final project, the students have to make a Spring Boot application with a web app and an API. And in the first video, we saw how easy it is to make a REST API with the Spring Boot starter files. So now we need the web application part, and the Spring Boot files do a whole lot of the work for us. We do need a couple more dependencies. So if I come down and look at the dependencies we have in the POM file, so that starter files we used brought in the Spring Boot starter web and Spring Boot starter test dependencies. We'll need two more to work with JSP, um, which both have to do with Tomcat, really. So add dependencies. As long as you're in a version of Spring Boot later than 3.0, um, if you go early, if you have a version earlier than 3.0, like 2 point something for some reason, uh, you would need the JSPL dependency as well, but we don't need that. So any Spring Boot 3 point something, we can uh, well, we could just type it right in the POM file. I'm going to go through the IDE and add dependencies and search the Maven repository. For the first one we need is Tomcat. They both have to do with Tomcat. So Tomcat embed Jasper, and that allows us to run the JSP pages. That sets everything up for the JSP pages. So we want to select any version of that. I'm going to delete the version number from the POM file so that it just always pulls the latest version. And we also need another one for Tomcat. We need Spring Boot Starter Tomcat. So the one that originally came in was just this most stripped down basic version of Tomcat. Having this in here will override that stripped down most basic version and make sure that we have the full version of Tomcat in there. We don't need the type or the version, so over here I'm going to delete those, and I'm going to make the alignment add up just because that uh, bothers me more than it should. There we go. Make those dependencies line up with the previous one. And again, we don't need the version. So I'm going to take the version out of there. So Tomcat embed Jasper and Spring Boot starter Tomcat. We will also need those dependencies. So I'll save that and close this. And we're ready to make our, almost ready to make our JSP pages, but we have to tell this project where those JSP pages will be found. And we do that in the, oh, that's not where it's at. Let me collapse that. It should be under other sources. Oh yeah, other sources, source main resources, default packages. NetBeans changes these around. So let me jump over to File Explorer real quick. Windows E. So in File Explorer, if I go to the NetBeans project, there's Eats, some other projects integrated for the class. So talk to text, data structures, stuff with Docker. Hopefully it's going to be a really interesting class. So if we in the source file, and this is why we'll be using Ant most of the way through the project because the source files are only one folder deep there. Oh, not in that one. In source main resources is application properties. So NetBeans, the browser there doesn't seem to accurately reflect where that is. I could have just left that open. We're going to be back there in a minute. But under other sources and the default packages, you should see application properties. And we need two things in here. We need to tell it which folder the JSP stuff will be in. So our Spring framework, the MVC package, which is the web apps. Well, there's views that has to do with the front end, the stuff we actually see. And prefix is what the prefix for the file path. So what folder are those in? And I'm going to go with the default for Tomcat. So there's a web INF folder, or there's going to be a folder called web app, and in that will be web information. And then I'll make another folder called JSP, and they will be in there. But then we also need the Spring MVC view suffix, so we don't have to type that every time, and we're going to look for .jsp at the end of the files. Those are the ones we're concerned with. This folder doesn't exist yet. That's why it's underlined. It has a Tomcat dependency, so it knows there's going to be a web information folder, but we haven't created the JSP folder. So let's do that. And I probably should have just left File Explorer open a moment ago. I prefer to do this in File Explorer. You can do it in the IDE, but if we go in here in Source, under Main, so parallel to our main folder, we need one called Web App, or we can call it whatever we want, but when they made Tomcat, when they originally made the Tomcat server, they called it Web App, so it's often good to stick with those names if we know we're launching on a Tomcat. Here in Windows File Explorer, can hit Control-Shift-N, and we need Web App in all lowercase letters. And then in that, again, when they made Tomcat, they set up that web information folder. We can call it something else, but it's easier if we stick with the files or stick with the names that they made when they designed Tomcat to begin with, since we know we're going to be launching on a Tomcat server. And in that, I said there's going to be a folder called JSP, and that's where we will find that's where we'll put our JSP pages. So when we close that and come back over here, it added them. We can NetBeans put that under other sources. So we'll go down here, and this is where we need to put our JSP pages. And we can probably go ahead and close this for now. We might be done with it. We'll probably come back and put health and metrics from the actuator there so that we can like see how many hits our page gets and all the telemetry about the things. So if we right click on that JSP folder and create a new JSP, which might have to go to other, I'll go down here. On the latest versions of NetBeans, they just load, it's under JSF pages. If you go looking for JSP, it's hidden under JSF, the updated version. We'll be using JSP, so select JSF, and then right down here, we want the standard syntax JSP file. Not segments right now, just the JSP file. And this one will be the home page. So I'll call it home. Ignore this message. That has to do with NetBeans knowing what server it is, but we have Maven knows what server we're launching at. Or we embedded the Tomcat server instead of linking to an external Tomcat. So that error message is going to, or warning is just to be ignored for now. And finish that. That'll create the page, which latest versions of NetBeans also seem to bring in from the JSF template. If we create a JSP, so these two, you'll see that those are part of the JSF, so we don't need those tags. And I have no idea why it's looking for HTML4. That was years ago. So I'm going to take out all that HTML4 stuff and put HTML in lowercase to indicate HTML5. And again, it put the JSF pages. So take out the JSF stuff. I don't know why NetBeans is doing that. Maybe it's just the installation I have, but it used to give this as the template for JSP and had JSF as a different template. But when I installed it reinstalled NetBeans a couple weeks ago, it started doing that. So what is this? This is Eats homepage, and here we're gonna call this from a controller. I'm just gonna put a message to that effect. So the Spring Boot page controller says a message, and we give this syntax to send. Whoops. This syntax for the attributes we want to send from the Spring controller. $, and then curly braces, which is different than the do Java in a JSP file, which we will see that syntax here very shortly as well. So that's all we'll need for the home page. We'll add some links here shortly. I guess we could add a link to the there is there's an API of local restaurants. That seems like a good sentence there. And that, and then I'll link to that. I'll put the closing one first, since my cursor was way over there. An anchor tag with a hyperlink reference to dot for the current location, and then we'll go to eateries. That one we did in the previous video. So a link to the API so we can see that quickly. That'll finish out our Java server page. Now we need a web application to call it. So I'll go back up to the main package where all the Java applications are being created and create a new Java class. And this one, I'll just call page controller. Page controller, that seems like a good name for it. It's in the right package and everything, so let's go ahead and create this and get rid of the clutter here. The java.comments are very, very useful, but for examples, they just kind of serve as clutter. In an actual project, for your final project that these videos are preparing for, you will definitely want to include the java.comments. That will be one of the requirements. But for the example, they're just kind of clutter. So in our class, this needs to look at the Spring framework, and this is going to be a controller. I'll do the import. And remember, on the REST API, it was a REST controller. So for the JSP pages, it's just a controller. And we'll make a method, and these need to return a string. Return a string, I'll call it home, and this needs a parameter of model type, which I'll just call model as well. Give it the same name, that's a good name for it. And the return is the name of that JSP page. So we have that home.jsp, and in application properties, we said we're just looking for .jsp files. So all the stuff in the background will add the JSP. We just need to say home. We're going to return the home page, home.jsp page. And we told it where to look for that and what extension it will have. And then we need something in our model, which I need to import that. Yep, Spring Framework. That's the one we want. And when we set up the JSP, we said that there is a message in the syntax to indicate that that message is coming from the Spring controller object. And that comes in from that model, which the stuff in the background, one of those dependencies will pass the model in. So it exists. We don't have to instantiate it or anything. But we do need to add an attribute, this bottom one here, with a string and a value. The string is the name of it, and then the value that we want it to be. And the string, we're going to call it message. That needs to match this part. And the value of it is some test string. Hello, hungry world. That seems like it fits with a tip calculator. So it's going to get this message. So we return the name of the JSP file, and then we build attributes to load into that. Add attributes to our model to load into it. And then we just need to map this to something. And that one's the same as in the REST API earlier. So we're going to do a request mapping. This time I will do an array. So I'll do it with the curly braces for an array and maybe just a slash. So the original domain name, which is localhost port 8080 in our case. And I'll also do this on /home. That way we have more than one URL. Then we'll go back to this page and do that import. And we should be ready to run a test. So when we run it, as to build, which Maven projects usually take longer to build. We added some dependencies to the POM file, but those must have already been on my computer. So at this point, yours will probably take a little bit longer to load in those dependencies. Then if I push Windows 1, open the browser, again, localhost 8080, and now we have a home page going on here. And that was just put in the HTML portion. And here is our message from the controller object. So that's what it takes to get our JSP pages up and running. And then a nice little link to go over to the API so we don't have to go keep typing that in. Those are really, really useful in your projects. So yeah, so that's a basic JSP page. One more step still to go because the final projects do require a web application. So you need something that you need your web page to do stuff like collect user input, do some processing, and give the user back some output. So we'll need a HTML form on the JSP and then just the traditional JSP syntax for Java processing for the application. And we'll do that in the next video, but it'll mostly follow suit from this. We'll have a couple things in the controller sends back. Hopefully all those steps made sense and you're starting to see how easy it is to build the Java projects with the Spring Boot. We don't have to worry about all that background stuff. We don't have to say how this runs. All of that's built in the background, so it's almost like doing a Python project. Only in Python we don't have any control over it. That stuff's in the background, so we just never think about it. But with Spring Boot, we almost don't have to think about it. But we still have control. We can still go into any of these. Jar files are just zip folders. So we can still go in there to any of those source code things in there and make changes if we want control over it, but we don't have to spend time setting up all that functionality about how our program runs. We can just dive right into the Java part. So Spring Boot is really nice for that. So one more video here where we will do some stuff in our JSP page to make it an actual web application, which is going to be the other main requirement in the final project. See you in the next video.